It was about 14 years ago. I attended a wedding in Lubbock at the Broadway Church, and it was one of our members' daughters that was getting married there. And I met a man. I might have met him a time or two before that, but it was at that wedding that we talked. And then he lived in Colorado. And so on his way home, I had already driven 2 hours back to my place after the wedding. So he ended up calling me about, 9 o'clock at night, something like that. And we talked for 3 hours as he was driving. And finally it got to be about midnight, and that's very late for David. So we got off the phone. But I knew something unique was going to go on with him. It just seemed like his wife had left him. She'd been through veterinarian school. She'd gone for an internship and had an affair with the veterinarian that she was interning with. Told her husband that she was going to move. And he said, well, I'll sell the house and I'll be there as quick as I can, get rid of my job. And she told him that he was not invited to move with her, that he was out of her life. It was that man that I talked to all of that way home. It was, 3 or 4 months later, we had an early sunrise Easter service out at a pond about a half mile from the church building there in Portales, New Mexico. And this man was there. His parents worshiped where I preached. And there's a picture of him sitting there. The benches were almost icy that morning. It was a cold Easter morning, especially in New Mexico. And just down from him was my middle daughter. And we've got this picture. It actually ended up in our church directory. I'll tell you that to tell you that about 3 or 4 months after that, Chad ended up being back at church again, and Shannon had gone to Pine Springs down in the mountains of New Mexico. And I called and asked her if she could get back for church that night, because I had someone that I wanted her to talk to. And she said, well, we planned on stopping in Roswell, but we'll try to get back. So she got back about halfway through worship, and she and Chad started talking to one another. And they talked together for hours and hours. They've been married 13 years now. I don't think they've quit talking yet. They're still talking to one another. It goes on and on. A long story to tell you that I did not know I was going to meet my son-in-law that afternoon at a wedding in Lubbock. Didn't have that planned. Didn't have that anticipated. But that's who I met. And Chad's dad is a great man of God, and he didn't really need me from a spiritual standpoint in a lot of ways. But we have been getting closer for 13 years. And maybe you're getting closer to your father-in-law. And maybe you're wondering what sort of legacy you're going to leave with your children and grandchildren. And what sort of legacy there's going to be in your relationships. I know my son-in-law and I are getting very close, because when I was up there a couple of weeks ago, we talked about several deep issues. But the deepest of all was the one he laid on my heart. He said, I need you to talk to me about how to be a dad to Christian men. My 2 oldest grandsons there were baptized this summer. And I thought for a moment, I'd never dealt with that. I have 3 daughters. I wanted to be a dad to Christian daughters, but I hadn't thought about being a dad to Christian men. And he really challenged me. I told him what I wrote there in your article about the only thing that I believe to be true. The only person you can really influence is you. You don't have the ability to change anyone else. And as much as dads would love to have the legacy of giving their faith to their children, we just can't give it to them. We can only live it before them. And as much as sons-in-laws would like to have a good relationship with their father-in-law, sometimes that happens easily and naturally. Sometimes there's some tension that goes there. After all, I raised this beautiful daughter, and now he's got her. I don't know how to feel about that. Is he going to take care of her the way I would? But you find out, no, he really does love my daughter, and he wants what's best for her. And they have 3 sons now. And he asked me, I need you to talk to me about being a good dad to my sons. I want to leave a good legacy with them. Maybe a long introduction, hopefully not too long a sermon. Exodus chapter 2. There is a relationship established between a fellow by the name of Moses. Now, Moses means drawn from the water because he had been drawn out of the Nile by the daughter of Pharaoh and had been raised as the prince of Egypt. He had been nursed by his mother, who was a Hebrew. Her name was Jochebed. Most of you know this. And Moses had been trained in the ways of Israel. When Moses got to be 40 years old, he saw these folks fighting, and he thought it was his job to deliver the Israelite. So he killed an Egyptian. Thought God was going to use him now to liberate Israel. That was his general heritage. Though he looked and sounded like an Egyptian, he was an Israelite. But instead, he is charged with murder, and he is having to flee. So we pick up in Exodus chapter 2, down in verse 15. When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Now what we're going to find out this morning is everybody's trying to kill Moses. Pharaoh tries to kill him when he's a little baby. We're going to find Pharaoh now, a different Pharaoh, trying to kill him when he's 40 years old. In a minute, God's going to try to kill him, which I find pretty interesting. Wait just a minute. Wait, I thought you were God's man. God says, no, I'm fixing to take you out. This text is a little strange there. But Moses sits down by this well, and that's where we have the text that Jackson read for us earlier. We won't reread that. Reuel's 7 daughters come to water the flock, and every day they used to fill the water troughs, and then some thugs would come along and drive off their sheep, water their own sheep. They'd fill the water trough again. Some more thugs would come and drive off their sheep. They'd fill the water trough. This time, Moses is there. And Moses says, we're watering our flocks. They're the ones that filled the trough, and they're the ones that are going to feed or water their flock. So they water the flock and go home early. And Reuel, which means friend of God, says, how'd you get home so quick today? And they say, well, we had this fellow help us. And you heard how Moses marries Zipporah. Now, Jethro, that's Reuel's other name, the friend of God, is a priest of Midian. What I find very interesting here is that Moses is educated in all the ways of Egypt, worldly education. His mother trained him to be a Hebrew, spiritual education. His father is of what's going to become the priestly lineage. Amram is of the tribe of Levi. But it is to a priest of Midian that God sends Moses. You never know how relationships are going to be established, but this relationship is established. God takes Moses from Egypt, sends him to the wilderness to a priest. Now, Jethro is a priest to God Most High. He's not just some random priest. He is a priest to God Most High. Remember Melchizedek 6 weeks ago. God has people at work all over the world. And he has a priest in Midian prepared for Moses. Moses, the murderer, is now run away from Egypt, accused of murder, finds himself in the wilderness of Sinai, in the land of Midian, with this fellow by the name of Jethro. Now, in Exodus chapter 3, Moses is pasturing Jethro's flocks, the priest of Midian. And he sees the burning bush. You all know that story very well. That's in Exodus chapter 3. He sees the burning bush, and God tells him, I want you to go to Egypt and release my people. Moses isn't too keen on that, doesn't know how that's going to work out. I'm not the guy to send. God says, you're my man. Eventually, they work through all those details, and we find ourselves over in Exodus chapter 4. Exodus chapter 4. Something strange happens in this relationship between Moses and Jethro. Notice, pick up in verse 18. Moses departed and returned to Jethro, Exodus 4:18. His father-in-law. said to him, "Please let me go, that I may return to my brethren who are in Egypt to see if they're still alive." And Jethro said to Moses, "Go in peace." For years now, they've been living in conjunction with one another. Moses has been acting as a son to Jethro. Moses asked permission to leave, and his father-in-law says, "Go in peace." Family dynamics were a little different back in their day. Family dynamics were maybe not so much different. How do you feel when your son-in-law says, "We decided to move to Alaska. We got somewhere to be and something to do. We're not going to be right here close to you anymore"? Well, go in peace. Make sure you love her on the way. Moses takes Zipporah and Gershom and Eleazar, their two sons, and he heads for the land of Egypt. Heads for the land of Egypt. They get to this place where they're going to spend the night. Notice what it says down here in verse 24. It came about at the lodging place on the way that the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. I'm scratching my head. God, you told me to go to Egypt. I got myself ready and I'm headed to Egypt. Told my father-in-law goodbye. He said, "Go in peace." I've got my wife and my sons with me and we're on our way. When we get to the stopover place and you say, "You want to kill me." It's hard to tell for sure if he wants to kill him or Eleazar. The text is not real clear. But God wants to kill somebody. We're sitting here saying, "What's going on, God? You're the one orchestrating all of this. Why are you so angry?" Well, look what Zipporah does in verse 25. Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and threw it at Moses' feet and said, "You are indeed a bridegroom of blood to me." So he let him alone. At that time she said, "You are a bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision." Whatever's been going on in Moses and Zipporah's life, they've had some split religious differences. Moses is circumcised as a child on the 8th day, but he doesn't circumcise his own son. And evidently Zipporah wasn't too much in favor of that, or he might have been circumcised earlier. Do any of you ever have religious squabbles at your house? Don't answer that. We wonder what's going on. How are we going to live our faith out? And Zipporah finally comes and says, "All right then, if God's going to wipe us out if we don't follow his will." Now Moses is bringing his family back into covenant relationship with Israel down in the land of Egypt. But she takes that foreskin and circumcises her son and throws it on the ground at Moses' feet, said, "You're a bridegroom of blood to me." I don't know what happens then. Here's the hard part of being a son-in-law and a father-in-law. There's a great gap in the text. We don't know what goes on. Zipporah is upset, and Moses sends her home. He just tells her to get. Exodus chapter 18 is where the story picks up. And this is where we'll tell it quickly. Exodus chapter 18. Moses went on to Egypt. He went ahead and did all the 10 commandments. All of the 10 plagues. He's headed out to Mount Sinai to get the 10 commandments. A lot of time has elapsed. And here's the gap in the story. The last time we saw Zipporah, Gershom, and Eleazar, they were on their way to Egypt with Moses until Exodus 18. Now Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how the Lord had brought him out of Egypt. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Moses' wife Zipporah after he had sent her away. Do all of your versions say sent her away? Anybody got anything different? Had sent her away. You know that passage over in Malachi 2:16 that we don't like at all? God hates divorce. The exact same word. Sent her away. Moses had sent Zipporah away. Well, that's a nice sermon if you want to preach it at that point. It's also the same word that's used when Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden. God sent them away from the garden. Sort of get some separation language going there. But don't get too hung up on it, because it's also the same word that Noah has when the dove is sent out of the ark. He sent the dove away. I just want you to wrestle with what that word means. It may mean divorce. It may mean simply sent away. Moses somehow sent Zipporah back home. You go back home. And she moves back in with her father. And years later, Moses is there, not years, but sometime later. And he's coming back, and Jethro, his father-in-law, says, I've got my daughter and his sons, and we're going to reconcile. I don't know how great the chasm was. I just know that somehow his daughter is at home when she had headed to Egypt with her husband, and he's going to reconcile their relationship. Fathers-in-law, sometimes you have the need to be a spiritual worker in your family. You need to be sure you leave the legacy that you can leave. And Jethro's decided that he's going to do what he can to reconcile the relationship between Zipporah and Moses. So he shows up. And it's interesting to me that, verse 5, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness, where he was camped at the Mount of God. He sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons with her. Then Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, and he bowed down and kissed him, and they asked each other of their welfare and went into the tent. Jethro reaches out to Moses. I don't know how bad the divide was, but he says, here's your wife and your sons. Sends messenger. I think that's the critical point. Moses has the opportunity to reject. Well, I'm too busy dealing with Israel. How are they going to accept a Midianite wife? What are they going to do with me? What are they going to do with my sons? They are circumcised, but they're still sort of outsiders. Moses doesn't ask any of those questions. He falls on his father-in-law's neck and kisses him. The reconciliation occurs. They get their act together. Ancestry.faith is about us living our faith in such a way that we help leave a legacy with our family behind us. Moses had a job to go do. He goes and does that job. I don't know the distance that had been created, but Jethro is going to make sure that Moses' wife comes back to him. And we don't hear much about Zipporah or Gershom or Eliezer. We don't have a lot of their history after that. But we do hear a lot about Jethro and Moses. They became tight again. They were good friends once more. And maybe you've had some distance in your family and there's a voice you need to listen to or someone that you can hear. Maybe you're worried about what your grandfather thought when you need to be worried about what your grandchildren are going to deal with. You need to be the one that sets a spiritual legacy that says, we're going to be God's people. We're going to follow God as well as we can. And he brings Zipporah back to Moses, and their family is reconciled. Moses and Jethro get along well. And now the rest of this chart just unfolds throughout the rest of this chapter. They begin to acknowledge one another. Moses' father-in-law, in verse 8, Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had befallen them on his journey, and how the Lord had delivered them. Moses unloads on Jethro. Let me tell you everything that's been going on. Well, we've been through it. We've had some tough times with Israel. God's been at work in our world. Sort of like my son-in-law asking me, how do I raise godly men? He lives with a lot of people that are helping him be church. But he's able to ask me the question outside. You know, one of the most powerful things that happens at a funeral, getting ready for the funeral, is when I walk into someone's house and they've got all sorts of family there. All sorts of family gathered around for this funeral event that's going to occur. And all these people are there. The minute I walk in and sit down on the couch, every story the family ever had is now retellable. You ever think of that? They all know their stories. They can't sit around and tell their stories. But the moment that an outsider is introduced into the environment, everyone can tell their story again. all the stories are open game. I think that's what's going on with Moses and Jethro here. Moses has something he needs to unload. Let me tell you what God's been doing for me in Israel. There's been a ton of stuff going on, all this stuff that I've had to deal with. And he can't tell anyone in Israel that. They've all been living it with him. And he can't tell Aaron. Aaron's the one that's been helping get in trouble. And I mean, they've got all sorts of these issues going along here. But he now has his father-in-law. Will you be an ear for me? If you're not taking advantage of those ears in your life that are willing to listen to you, your mother-in-law, your father-in-law, your son-in-law, your daughter-in-law, if you're not listening to those folks that are willing to hear you, if you're not taking advantage of those relationships, start doing that. Wow, I'm dealing with this at work. They don't know anybody else at work. They just love you and want what's good for you. You can tell them all of your story. Be sure and listen when they start talking to you. My son-in-law got my attention when he asked me that question, and we're getting closer because of it. Well, of course, Jethro's going to celebrate the relationship in verse 12. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God. Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law before God. They celebrate the relationship, and then they sort of enact the relationship. They empower the relationship as it closes out here. Jethro comes the next day and watches Moses. Moses is watching over Israel, and everybody's coming to him with problems. He spends all day long just listening to people and all of their issues. And Jethro says, "What are you doing, man?" "Well, I'm the one that tells them the will of God. I tell them God's word, and then we make a decision about what's going on in their life." And he says, "You're going to wear yourself out. You can't handle this strain. You can't do that. You need to select some good men over hundreds and fifties and tens. You need to select some good men that are going to be able to assist in this work, much like y'all just did as we selected new elders. You need to select some men that we can spread the work around to. You need to select some folks that can help with this." And so Moses selects some folks, and it works perfectly. Notice what happens here. Everybody's going to them in verse 22. "Let them judge the people at all times, and let it be that every major dispute they will bring to you, but every minor dispute they themselves will judge. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this, and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all these people also will go to their place in peace." So Moses listened to his father-in-law. My favorite verses in the whole thing. Moses listened to his father-in-law. No, Moses listened to his father-in-law. Hey, Jethro knows something. He's a priest of God Most High, but he's got some wisdom. It may be that your father-in-law is talking and you're not listening to him. He may be an ungodly man that you shouldn't listen to, but he might have some advice that would help you. He's lived ahead of you, a generation ahead of you. Moses listened to his father-in-law and did all that he had said. Moses chose able men out of all of Israel, made them heads over the people, leaders of thousands and hundreds and fifties and tens. They judged the people at all times. The difficult dispute they would bring to Moses, but every minor dispute they themselves would judge. Then Moses bade his father-in-law farewell and went his way to his own land. A long story, a long chapter, with a simple take-home that I pray you'll take advantage of. Who has God placed in your life to be a mentor and guide? Our men's class talked about leaving a legacy today. Jethro's intent on helping Moses leave a legacy. There could have been some alienation there that never was reconciled, and it's reconciled. And then there could have been an ignoring of the father-in-law. Their relationship is secure. And Moses finds an ear that he needs that's outside of Israel that he can talk to. And God is able to be a blessing in their relationship. There's someone that you need to be a guide and mentor to. But there's also someone that you need to let be a guide and mentor to you. A voice you trust. Someone that needs to hear from you. Someone you need to hear from. God didn't intend for us to live isolated. He intended for us to live in families. I'm not at all worried about my grandsons in Colorado because their dad wants to raise godly men. I'm not worried about my grandchildren in Washington, D.C. because their dad wants to raise godly children. That's his intent. That's their goal. Oh, we talk about all sorts of things, may disagree about all sorts of things, but I know my sons-in-law want to raise men and women that are powerful in God's kingdom. I believe that and trust that. If you've got a relationship you need to mend, then mend that. If you need someone to talk to you about raising godly sons, I don't get to hang out with my son-in-law a lot, but I'll hang out with you, and I'll talk with you. And sometimes these elders need someone to come and talk to. And sometimes they need people to come and talk to them. And you just may have a relationship with someone that no one else has. You're a friend to someone that no one else is a friend to. And they need you to simply say, this is how we're going to be God's people in this place. And how we're going to choose to live for Him. The legacy we leave will be one of faith. It will be one of hope and one of trust. May you be faithful in all your relationships in Christ Jesus. As together we stand and as we sing.